Okay, welcome to our section on poverty, inequality, and discrimination. Topics sound awfully depressing, uh, but the analysis that we can do and some of the top things we can talk about actually make this kind of a very interesting section for microeconomics. And um, s the analysis, and there's quite a few intricacies on these things. Um, so first thing, what is it? What does poverty mean? Well, poverty means to be poor, right? And there's a poverty line in the United States. It's a very specific level of income below which you're considered to be poor. Um, Traditionally, it's been based on the amount of money spent on a minimal diet multiplied by three. There are discussions on exactly how to change that or if that's the appropriate amount. Um, Statistics on what it meant to be impoverished. So in 2013, a family of four making $23,350 or less are considered poor. And how many are poor? Well, it's going to vary year to year. 2012, it was 15%. That is up some from 2009, although it's going to make sense why it's up. You know, the economic conditions from 2007 to 2013, it's there makes sense with the downturn that the poverty rate would go up, especially once we learn a little bit more about how this is constructed. Okay, I want you to take a moment and pause this. The question I ask, is it easy to get poor, right? Nobody really wants to be poor, presumably. Is it easy to be considered poor? Take a moment. Suppose you have a family of four, and let's say two adults, two children, right? Both, probably should have the word parents in here, but say both adults work minimum wage jobs, which we're saying $7.25 an hour, which is the federal minimum wage, 36 hours per week, 48 weeks per year. So this is not a full-time work week, right? That's generally considered 40, and 4 weeks of not working per year. 4 weeks of vacation, at least time off from work. Is this family in poverty? Let's take a moment and pause and do these calculations. Okay, I hope you've paused and done the calculations. You should have found the answers no, they're not in poverty. This family, with $7.25 an hour times $7.25 times 36 times 48 times 2 should get you a little over $25,000. To be considered in poverty, this family of four would need to be making $23,350. So minimum wage, almost full-time but not quite, and not working every week of the year, but most weeks of the year, not considered poor. What does this tell us? I think it tells you a few things, right? One, it's tough to be considered in poverty if you're working, right? We've looked at about the lowest case you can get of people who are working. They're not even working full time, and they get 4 weeks off per year, and they're working for the lowest possible wage that's legally allowed, which is $7.25. They're not poor, right? So they're not considered in poverty. So one, it's not easy to be considered poor if you're working. It's almost impossible to be considered poor if you're working. The other thing some people have noted is, they go through this and they're like, wow, its poverty rate is not much. And it's somewhat of a normative question of not much, but certainly I know that I cannot imagine trying to raise a family of four near the poverty line. I think that would be extraordinarily difficult. Now, the one thing to note, a lot of federal aid is not based on being in poverty. Like if you're close to poverty, I don't even know if it's 150% of the poverty line or whatever, but like food stamps, it isn't strictly just poverty that indicates whether you get food stamps or not. It's some percentage above the poverty line. So related to poverty, we asked the question, did the war on poverty work? War on poverty, this was declared in '64 by Lyndon Johnson. Naturally, you declare a war on poverty, it's an effort to decrease poverty rates. So LBJ wanted to decrease the poverty rates. The first thing, and macroeconomic analysis is different. In ways, this is a macro question, even though we're in a micro course, but poverty tends to fall within microeconomics when we're the split between the two classes and how do you allocate the topics. Question we ask is, what would be a good way to find this out, right? The first thing a lot of people would think is, well, did it work, right? Well, yes, but how do you define whether it worked or not? From there, a lot of people will go, well, when you put the war on poverty in place, did poverty rates drop? And that seems somewhat logical, except if poverty rates were dropping, say, the 10 years before the war on poverty plan was put into place, and then you put the war on poverty into place and they continued to drop at the same rate, do you give the credit for that subsequent drop to the war on poverty? You could argue, you could make a case if there's other things that are going on that would have changed it, that yes, but you could certainly make the case of no. I raise these initial questions as it's never clear cut, but what we're going to look at here is going to shed some insight onto what we can claim on the effectiveness of the war on poverty. Okay, this blue line is poverty rates as defined by the U.S. The red line here includes in-kind benefits like food stamps, for example, and other benefits that aren't cash aren't counted when considering whether somebody is in poverty, which is one of the criticisms we will be placing on the poverty rate in a moment. So, war on poverty is declared in about 64. So, government programs declared in 64. The first money that's allocated and the programs that are passed started, taking place in 65, maybe right around here. How long does it take for a government program to really start to have any sort of an impact? Maybe a year and a half, 2 years. So if it's end of 65, are we going to say maybe beginning of 67? That's maybe when we would start to see these policies have an impact. While poverty rates dropping, declaration of the war on poverty had dropped before, continues to drop right around the time when you might think those policies would start to have an impact. Poverty rates don't change at all. Now, does that mean we can say the war on poverty didn't matter at all for poverty rates or was counterproductive? It doesn't mean that, right? There could have been other things going on. But as we will be learning in the section a little bit later, some of these programs had horrible side effects for efficiency in terms of people not working and may have extended time, might have encouraged poverty. So going through this, and this points out the recessions as well, the poverty rate, since this was implemented, and especially since the programs would have started to have any impact, poverty rate hasn't dropped. And what's pretty sad is that it had dropped for the 20 years before 67. It had dropped continually. Now, it can't drop forever, right? It's, at some point you get to zero and you can't drop beyond that. But right when those policies would have started to come into place and have an impact on the U.S. economy, that's when the poverty rate stopped dropping. Once again, it doesn't mean for sure you can say that the war on poverty had no or a negative effect, right? There might be a problem with the definition. Once in-kind transfers are included, it looks a little bit lower, even though the rate of the decrease wasn't as high. But one thing I think we can be very comfortable in saying, we do not have evidence that the war on poverty decreased poverty rates, right? You look at that trend line, poverty rates were declining quite a bit more, at a much faster rate before the war on poverty than after. The war on poverty, we don't have evidence that it actually worked, unfortunately.